Hello, grade 11s. This will be the final week of screencasts in history in grade 11. It's going to be based on chapter 7, which is about Lenin's Russia. So let's take a look. In chapter 7, we're going to be examining this man, Vladimir Lenin, and here he is again here speaking to the loyal troops on the steps of what looks like maybe the Tauride Palace. And we're going to be seeing how this man rules Russia, how he consolidates his rule so that he can rule, and then finally what policies he enacted. And what we're going to see is these key questions are: how did these Bolsheviks consolidate power in the new Soviet state they've created? Why did the Bolsheviks win the Russian Civil War? We'll also find out why the Civil War broke out in the first place. Why was there war communism that was introduced in 19? And then why was it replaced by the new economic policy just several years later in 1921? To what extent did the new Soviet state rely on terror and coercion? Quite a bit. Lenin is known as the father of state terrorism. And finally, what was the relationship between the Bolshevik Russia and the rest of the world? So here's the man, Lenin, leading the Soviet state. How did he establish control of the government? Well, he delivered his promises. And there'd be promises for peace, promises of land. He's going to suppress the opposition quite ruthlessly when he needs to. And he does establish control of the government by a couple means. And then there's some other things they're going to do that we'll elaborate on. First of all, in Russia, in 1917, they have the second All-Russian Congress of Soviets on October 23rd. Please remember that this is after the October Revolution by Lenin. So we can see that there's 500 of the 670 delegates favor a socialist government, but the Mensheviks are not confident in support of Lenin, and even the Bolsheviks, such as Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were there, if you remember before, during the revolution, didn't support him either. So what we need to see is how Lenin deals with this. And what they do is they just ignore their opponents. Many of the opponents to Lenin's plans, the new executive committee, they leave. Hundreds of people leave. And as they leave, Trotsky says, "I'm relegating you to the dustbin of history." So now, by October 26th, the Bolsheviks control the important committees in the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Keep in mind, Lenin and Trotsky are hoping for an international revolution, one, to save their state, and two, because that's what Marx predicted. And all this is happening with not as much support as they would like. So let's see what happens next. So, how do you gain support? If you're Lenin, you promise things to people. You promise things to the soldiers, to the workers, to the peasants. You promise things about the war, the land, and the food. So let's take a look. So, Lenin makes a firm declaration in his decree announcing the assumption of power on the 26th of October. The Soviet authority will at once propose a democratic peace to all nations and an immediate armistice on all fronts. There's the peace. It will safeguard the transfer without compensation of all land. There's the land he's giving away. And who's he giving it to? The peasant committees. It will defend the soldiers' rights, introducing a complete democratization of the army. Wow. It will establish workers' control over industry. Yes. And it will ensure the convocation of the Constituent Assembly and the date set. And that's where he's giving permission to have an election to create the government that will create the new rules. If you read further, you'll see he's giving first necessity to the villages, he's giving out bread, and finally, all local authority shall be transferred to the Soviet workers and soldiers, peasants, deputies. So these are all the promises he's making, in part to ensure he's going to stay in power. Let's see how he does. So, here's a cartoon about how Lenin gains that support. He's seen as sweeping clear the country. He's sweeping out the bankers, sweeping out the church, sweeping out the nobility, sweeping out foreign influences. And he gives a decree on peace, a decree on land. As you see, the workers and soldiers are all to have a greater say in their matters. He gives a decree of self-determination for the states and nationalities, such as the Finns and the Georgians. Gives decrees on equality. And finally, he takes on the church properties and the banks. And if you take a look at the picture and you wanted to analyze it, you can start to see what are the images that are going on here, what's the meaning, what does each person represent, and I'll give you a minute to take a look. And of course, you can see Lenin sweeping the broom there. Definitely that's not a broom later. It might be the gallows. And an interesting aside is that when Lenin was in Siberia in exile with his wife, earlier in his revolutionary career, he actually had a maid that they didn't treat that well. So interesting juxtaposition there with him actually doing the brushing. So how did the Bolsheviks consolidate their power in the new Soviet state? Well, they suppress opposition, so they'll ban other parties. There's censorship, so the voice of others can't be heard. They'll put out propaganda, so it's only their message that's getting out. They'll abolish the class system, and they'll even abolish the names with ranks in the army. They'll purge the bureaucracy and just get in loyal Bolsheviks. They'll also get the support of the rail and communication workers. And finally, Lenin will bring in the Cheka. And here's a picture. So here's 4 gentlemen from the Cheka relaxing after a hard day at work. And one can imagine what they've been doing. Or can we? They're the secret police who are going to ruthlessly carry out Lenin's orders. And there's a picture of them at work. Yeah, they're piling up dead bodies. They murdered thousands.